Welcome to my YouTube channel, Truth Emotion Studios, which I now call Unpack Coltage, which is a term I coined. Coltage as in baggage that we walk around with that burdens us, and then as we look at it closer, we unpack it, we can take it apart and see what it is that we're dealing with. And for that end, I have my friend and mentor, I would say, Brad Jersak here from Canada with me. Hi.
Good to see you again.
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, always. So we already talked 2.5 years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic.
That's quite a while ago now.
Yeah. So for you personally, how has life been?
We were part of all the lockdown kind of stuff and how that affected education. And but also, like, I'm an introvert, so staying home appealed to me a lot, and we were just grateful that God provided enough income to manage that, because that wasn't the case for everybody. They people had different kind of crises and so on, but for me, we lost probably 40% of our income with the loss of itinerant ministry. That said, we learned how to use Zoom very well, and I also realized that this was meant to be a reset for me in terms of lifestyle. So post-COVID, I have not resumed 40 or 50 trips a year. I'm trying to keep it to about 6, and we've tightened our belts, and I'm focused on the magazine I work for. We're Christianity Without the Religion, it's called, CWRM, and my work at St. Stephen's University. So I've still got a lot of online students now, and IRPJ is part of that. That's the Institute for Religion, Peace, and Justice. So that's a peace studies degree. So I'm still like very busy with the magazine, with school, and then also, of course, writing, which makes me wonder how I had time to do all the traveling before. And then I realized, well, I didn't have time. I was a year behind on my writing. I was always behind on my grading. So, and now I'm getting older too. So I realize my body can only handle so many flights a year. So I'm quite happy with a new rhythm.
Yeah. And we, as your readers, are happy with your latest publication. Here it is.
Oh, you have a copy. Excellent.
Yes, of course. And I also read it. So
even better.
Yes, I speed read it, but some things definitely stood out for me greatly, and I want to go back and slow it down. Out of the Embers-Faith after the Great Deconstruction. Now, I do have to ask though, have you considered calling it a more Christ-like deconstruction?
I could have, but I kind of liked having a complete trilogy and just leave it at that. But I think that there's a point to be made there. That is what's driving the big arc of my writing, is this idea of where Christ is our North Star. And so whatever we're doing, including deconstruction, really, we can come at it with that approach, that whatever our deconstruction is, that it could clear away hindrances to faith rather than just being an abandonment of it. And I particularly feel that strongly with Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for my channel, it's usually our conversations are around spiritual abuse coming out of cults, literally cults, not just unhealthy theology, but also the unhealthy people that led us and took over our lives. And I am now at a place in my understanding where I cannot separate toxic theology from spiritual abuse. So when you come out of something so extreme and so bad, there's layers to how you get over it and how do you unpack everything. And so the first layer for me was looking at, of course, the subtle power of spiritual abuse. Here's me with picking up all the books again that I have lying around here. This is the German version that my mom gave me back in the day. But this was the book that gave me the language to say what I learned, what I had been through. And then the next step was, okay, it wasn't just really nasty people. What they were teaching me that I was holding on to still, that was also really bad and worthy of taking a closer look. Now, as you describe in the book accurately, it wasn't that I was like, hey, everybody, just so you know, I'm now going through a deconstruction phase. Just bear with me. That's not how it happened. It would be difficult for me now to really point out when exactly did I dare to even question any of that. Some things were fairly simple, but other things like atonement theory, that is like wherever I go, people would be like, yeah, they shouldn't have scared you with hell, but they still were right. So
Okay.
as long as you walk that weird line, at some point it's like, I can't ignore this elephant anymore. And when I threw out the idea, and I can't really tell you anymore how, that I think God is really good, like really good, and these things that scare us and that scare little children, it just can't be right. And as I pulled on that thread further, I wasn't alone. Things just came into place. And what I love about especially the first part of your book is that you identify and empathize with people who are losing their community because of the questions they started to ask, and that they're not satisfied with the canned answers anymore.
Yeah.
Speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's a real it's a reality for people, that even when they need to leave, you might even say even when Jesus leads them out from a very toxic community, you're still left with moving from community, however bad, into the possibility of alienation and isolation, which is also bad. But what do? And I would say also that some of the communities we were in, the one I was in was a healthier community with better, healthier people in that sense, but they still had the toxic theology. At least when the itinerant preachers would come through, the revivalists, right? That's when the revelation stuff would come out. That's when hell would come out. And so maybe in a normal course of the year, we still, we weren't getting a steady diet of that, but the pastor would invite these guys because they're coming to town, and then they, and we want to see people get saved. And so how do they do that? Well, highly manipulative preaching, including ultimatums and fear, and the rhetoric was really ugly. So that begs the question, though, like, can I question those things in a healthy community? And if I do, will I find myself needing to leave even the people I called aunt and uncle? And that suddenly this thing that was my very real family doesn't feel like home anymore. And so it's the same issue in terms of, while we might dial down the spiritual abuse element, it's exactly what you're saying, that the theological foundations for what constituted faithfulness can actually generate real PTSD. Yeah. If you don't, there's a way to cope with it. The way to cope with it is to treat it all as a cartoon in your head. As well, it's a flannel graph thing, I thought, and so here's people going off into hell. Isn't that sad? But it's flannel graph, right? But then when you start thinking, no, you're talking about my cousins now, and you're saying they're going to burn forever, and you're putting that beside God is good, and their blood is on my hands. Okay, now, so if you can't live with that anymore, well, I guess you don't. But can you still carry on in your community? And how much can you hear that stuff in that community before you're saying, enough, I've got to go? Okay, so now you've left. And now what do? Are you alone? And for many, they were. Gratefully, people are finding out that there's a vast community of people in the same boat, and we're finding each other in various ways. And some of that includes online communities where we were very skeptical of that before, because can you really fellowship with somebody you've never touched? And it's not as good. And yet it's been a lifeline for some people. And that can lead then to the next phase, where you're like developing a community of people that not only are healthier in their persons, but healthier in their theology. And for some of us, that takes a decade. And that decade includes pain that I do call for empathy on.
Yeah, yeah. Who did you have in mind when you wrote the book?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say there's, first of all, I had in mind those who were DMing me specifically, and
Direct
then the
messaging?
yeah, direct messaging me, and then the two types of responders are meant to overhear the book. So first of all, the people direct messaging me, there was a lot of them saying, look at, I'm going through deconstruction, whether it was voluntary or involuntary, whether it was theological or personal, but they hit a crisis. And why were they contacting me? Well, here's because of the two responses. So one response that they would be getting is, I'm deconstructing, and now my pastor is calling me a heretic, or he's even kicked me out of the church. My spouse is thinking about leaving me because I don't believe like he or she does anymore. I'm being treated like a backslider, and I just think I'm asking important questions, but the one kind of response treats it as a bad thing, and that I'm a bad person. And then the other kind of response the same folks could be getting was, they were getting a lot of positive responses from the deconstruction movement that weren't taking seriously the trauma involved. So they were acting like cheerleaders with pom-poms saying, yeah, burn it all down, empty the pews, just get out of there, you follow your heart, be a kite that cuts its own string, you can fly now, and then the kite hits a tree. And it's tangled in the tree, and these people are like, yeah, you're doing it. It's like, no, I'm not doing it. I've lost not only my community, I've lost my faith, I've lost Jesus, I've lost meaning. I'm like, well, so a word that would come up repeatedly was, I'm bereft, hopeless. And so they would DM me and say, look at, like, the deconstructionists are not helping me. They just sound like evangelicals expecting me to have a good testimony of deconstruction. So I'm looking at those two, those who demonize deconstruction and those who idolize deconstruction, and the poor people caught in between who just are hurting. So that's kind of the front lines of who I'm addressing in the book. But because there's a range of genres, I also end up, kind of catching the interest of those who were wondering about my memoirs, my story, and then others who are more academics who love the middle section, and then the sort of the contemplative and the spiritual formation people who like the third section on what now, how do we live, who do we listen to.
Oh, there's so much I want to touch on. Where to begin? So as a teacher, of course, I've heard of the term constructivism in pedagogy. That's just the theory of how do we acquire learning. If it was as easy as I told you ABC, and now you know ABC, then we'd all know ABC. But that is not how learning functions. We construct our thinking, we construct the world and our theology from at any point on, and deconstruction speaks into exactly that. How we learn anything, that's a natural part of the process. At some point you would take a step and be like, usually when something's not working, what is going on here? Am I maybe misunderstanding something? And so in your A More Christ-Like God book, it's still, I love this one as well. You are also referencing the stages of faith and how many of us stay in stage number 2, which is basically kindergarten. And the point is that we are not really in a faith culture where questioning is allowed, because we got so heady, but not intellectual. We got so good at parroting. Well, the answer is, of course, this. And so in that climate, where if you believe the wrong way and God catches you thinking that, you're in real trouble. How can you even allow yourself to think those thoughts? So what I'm thinking is, had I, and I've been saying this to a few of the people that I interviewed, had I seen this book 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, how terrible. I would have been one of those people that would have said, well, too bad, they lost it. They had to change it to something that is ear tickling or whatever. And now I've come through that process, and I'm saying, of course it has to be that. I mean, at least that's where I'm at. Otherwise, it's not good news. So what can we say to the people who check out my channel or who like to listen to you, and they are so afraid of questioning, of even and like starting that process of what if God is like, what if the Old Testament is something we can rethink, or all that? What, because the fear, how?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so important. And so the kind of person who's going to be afraid, I mean, probably there's a level of fear just about, will I be rejected?
Yeah.
But whether it's their own fear or the fear of the community that might reject them, the issue there is, if I ask these questions and walk this path, am I being faithful or am I being unfaithful? And if I'm unfaithful, I'm losing it and I'm bad and this is scary and I want to be faithful. So I want to look at that person in the very best possible light as someone who the most fearful people also maybe have a deepest passion towards faithfulness. And so what we don't want to do with those folks is say, you need to leave behind everything that made you feel stable. You need to just jump off the bridge and hope the updraft carries you into the heaven. That's not going to work for them. Well, happily for them, I know that feeling personally, and I found a path to work with it where I said, what if we have faithful questions? What if the Bible invites faithful questions, and even to, let's say, to take a conservative temperament? So in some ways, I'm a risk taker, but what drives especially my theology is I want to conserve the ancient faith of the apostles. Okay, so now I'm not just going off the end of a limb in some kind of airy-fairy liberalism. It's more like I'm crawling down the trunk of the tree to the very roots of our faith. Mm-hmm. I'm reading the scriptures more carefully, not throwing them out and setting the Bible aside. And I'm reading the first Christians instead of just the 16th century Christians. I'm saying, what are they saying in the first, second, third, fourth centuries about God? So that my deconstruction is actually, I'm removing constructs that took me away from faithfulness. Mm-hmm. So to be faithful in that sense is to say, let's examine the constructs that are actually idols. Mm. And that the great original deconstructionist was probably Moses, where at the golden calf incident, right? And that in the early church, they were very, very concerned to be faithful to Jesus Christ by examining thoroughly every construct of God that could become an alternative. Or so in that sense, I'm saying to those who are fearful, I hear that you are faithful. Let's do this together. And so that kind of person, they may want more Bible passages. They may want more citations. I can do that. I think the scriptures themselves are constant. Well, the prophets are constantly deconstructing the temple system. I want mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus is deconstructing the construct of the temple establishment and the abuse of leadership in the Sanhedrin. So it's a kind of positive way of doing deconstruction that says, I have an agenda, and my agenda is to be faithful, and my agenda is to help you to be faithful. And I get that it's messy, but your questions are actually not just doubts, they are acts of faithfulness.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do with that kind of temperament and those who are fearful in that sense. And of course you'll have accusers and like, well, okay, accuse me, but then let's go to the scriptures, because that's what we do, right? We go to the scriptures, right? We listen to the tradition, right? And what I've discovered is that the scriptures and the tradition are radical in terms, they're ruthless, in fact, in terms of questioning anything that could be a hindrance to our union with God in Christ.
Yeah. Yes, if you can find those right verses and focus. I'm speaking from that the Bible has also been used to trap me in very toxic thinking. So yes, so you can propose a alternative view. This, I feel like I'm saying something bad, an alternative view, or the orthodox, the original view that we as evangelical or Protestant people have been told is all evil, and that
it depends on what they want to do with the scriptures at that point, because if they're still addicted to needing a Bible verse for everything, I can go into that world and work from the inside out. But if they're just like, the Bible's dangerous to me, then it's like, well, then let's look at it from another angle. Let's look at the word good. What does good mean? And so you can come from a philosophical angle, or you can come from a healing angle. It's like, oh, you have PTSD. I wonder how we might address that trauma through inner healing. So it's almost like everybody has a different story. Everyone's on a different stage of their path. And so I don't feel like we can find a one size fits all response. We have to just start by listening and listening and listening, and then listening to the Lord and saying, oh, what would walking with this person look like? What's going to cause the light of Christ that is already in them to just burst out,
Yeah, that's good. For me, it's also a different approach. That first year in the US, so we were kicked out in December, and in January we moved to the US, where my husband's from, and there wasn't anyone really to do ministry to me with, because I couldn't say what happened to me. And my parents-in-law, their friends, they'd certainly listened to our stories and affirmed that was not good, what was happening and so forth. But I couldn't read the Bible anymore, because the way I had learned to read the Bible is wherever you open up to, that's the Lord talking to you that day, that minute. And it's somehow always so negative, so scary, and always puts me on this, how I'm not measuring up. So I had to lay the Bible aside. But what path I chose was, I found people in the community that were offering prayer ministry, and I joined them and became a prayer minister with them, because that's part of what I had been through my college. We were all kind of prayer ministers, and learned, which in theory sounds like a great idea, to listen to the Holy Spirit and then give prophetic visions and whatnot. And so now I'm looking at that much more critical. But here's the gist of that first year before I took a break from that for good. But what I felt the Spirit say through me to people was so positive, life-affirming, uplifting. That one time I had a vision of a cowboy man. And so I said that to the woman, and then she was like, well, I always envisioned God as this cowboy. And so those were, for me, practical experiences. Like you said, what is good? That was good. That was for uplifting, building up people. And it wasn't to tear down, which is what I was coming from. And I was told, and didn't dare to believe anymore that it would be otherwise. And so I experienced from almost like a witness from I wasn't the one who was sitting in the healing chair, but through me came healing to people. But it healed me because it gave me an opportunity to really believe that God is different than I had come to believe. And I think that is really what spurred all that.
I think one thing I noticed about your story there is that you developed a criteria for what is healthy. So you began to see that which tears down is not good, that which lifts up is good, and that you could do prayer ministry either way.
Mm.
And you could retrieve prayer ministry, which had been toxic, simply by changing your criteria. And I think, well, you could do that with the Bible then too.
Right.
So how we read the Bible in a way that uplifts instead of tears down. And then, so if that's going to be your criteria, which is a pretty good one, I think, tearing down versus lifting up. That sounds like Jesus, right? Perishing versus eternal life.
Yeah.
What Paul calls, he calls the gift of prophecy in 1 Corinthians 14. His criteria are strengthening, comforting, and encouraging.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you can actually do that in the flesh too, by turning it into flattery and manipulation and all of that. But someone of your experience, you'll know the difference because you feel the texture. It's different. And so what he was doing to you, what he was doing through you, right? As the uplifting thing is coming out of your mouth, it's actually also going in your heart.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So that was another way. And to go to, in the same time, two things I want to mention from your books. When you talk about Kierkegaard, good old Soren, who would have almost gotten my husband into prison because he's a philosophy major and he decided he was going to consider not paying taxes anymore, and because taxes go to the war machine, and Kierkegaard would not be okay with it, whatever. So that was also a long time ago. But so good old Soren, I loved how you write with this cautious angle of, okay, now I know how some people will, because of their hurt, because of their wounds, hear this. You will be inclined to hear what Kierkegaard is suggesting and be like, another prison, another burden that I cannot live up to. It's too much. And so you're addressing that as you're saying, well, he's not trying to make you feel guilty. He's trying to make you rethink the culture, and I'm not doing it very well justice. But I want to juxtapose that with what you said in A More Christ-like God, with your story of your neighbor when you guys were 7-year-old-ish, and you were told not to throw the hammer. I love that story because the vision that you're casting there of what it is like to actually get judged by God. Say more about that. So what I'm trying to point here is, so afraid of that judgment of God. And on the other hand, when we actually get judged by God, maybe it's this way.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd want to say about that is that all the judgments of God are restorative, and that Hebrews 12 says that you can assume that what you're dealing with in the corrections that God brings our way is that, first of all, that it's the corrections of a loving Father. And then later in the chapter, a little later in the chapter, he says, and what are the goal of these corrections from this loving Father is actually to strengthen your weak knees and lift up your sagging hands. So God the Father comes along and we might assume that our trials are just like, that he's angry at us and punishing us. And in the ancient church, they read these texts and they said there is no retribution. That means payback through punishment. There is chastisement where we pass through a correction, but I think the painful parts of that correction are mostly self-inflicted. And so, for example, if God gives a warning and then you disobey the warning and then you get hurt, you might think that the hurt is him punishing you.
Yeah.
When in fact, no, the hurt is the consequences he was trying to avert. So in the new book, I talk about my mom saying, look at Bradley, don't touch the red hot stove. Well, she says, don't touch the stove because it will burn your hands.
Yeah.
So I decide on my own, just like in the Garden of Eden, well, wait a minute, I'm going to reason this out. She probably just meant when the elements were red. And now the elements aren't red, so they're not hot. And so I can touch it and it won't burn me. So I touch it and it totally burns me. What do I do first? I go and I hide. Why would I hide? at least as that child, I didn't think my mom burnt me.
Right.
Whereas some adult Christians actually still think that about God. But that initial shame of my disobedience caused me to hide for fear of punishment, when in fact what I found out was when she finally found me, she completely loved on me, and she put my hand under cold water and brought relief, and so I got to see a lot about who she was, even through my disobedience and through my stumble. And I got to understand, I got to infer that my mom's not a punisher. She really cares about me, and that the harm that I experience when I defy her warnings is not inflicted by her, it's inflicted by my defiance. And I just think that opens up into the whole of the scripture. So then, so we see how what gets crassly called the wrath of God is really it ends up being a metaphor for him giving you the dignity of defying him and experiencing your own consequences. Because what else is he supposed to do? Strap you to a gurney? Like, so it's so funny to me that people get angry at God when they've defied him, and then they experience the consequences of what he warned them about in loving care. Anyway, that I suppose I shouldn't belittle that, because it's just natural to us, but we're going to have to learn a better way. Certainly we'll all stumble into that, but we shouldn't be teaching it, that he's this punisher who needs some kind of appeasement whenever we've offended him. That's pagan, with apologies to the pagans, because I don't even know if they believe that anymore. So
Right. Yeah, I have students who are pagans, the most
yeah,
loveliest kids. And
yeah,
so I remember it's so easy to say, oh, that's pagan. But it is to them, they're saying, I don't believe that. Yeah.
yeah,
So whatever that is, it is not what Jesus embodies.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And still it's easy to believe in the superstition of you did something wrong and now here comes the punishment. And yeah.
Some of it's from bad theology that we inherited, but also, I think some of it is just we infer it wrongly from life itself.
Right. Because not all of us had a nice mom like you did.
That's right. And so like I find people who are actually attracted to the bad theology from incidents before they were even Christians, like because they've already experienced attachment issues and trauma in the context of parenting or whatever, right? With that, life itself gave them a theology without even having a Calvinist having to do it, but then when the Calvinist comes along, it can really ring true, and they're like, yep, that's my story. It's like, it might be your story, but what a weird way to paint God into that story.
Right.
So
yeah, and I find when we start demonizing other people, that is often it hits the same spots. Like I actually wanted to hate all those people, and now I have or it's maybe too easy to hate all these people.
Oh yeah. So for example, I'm a recovered Calvinist. I have good Calvinist friends now. I know of Calvinists who actually have healthy theology. But I know what I taught. Yeah. And I'm even discovering that as I forgive Calvinist Brad, I'm less likely to project hatred and towards Calvinists who remind me of that me, right? But I do think we need to call out the Calvinist theology where it's actually harmful, right? So that's a little trickier, right? How do I do this with dear friends who identify that way? And well, gently, and we have good conversations about it. Yeah. But some of them still believe that if God burns you in a lake of fire for all eternity, that's good. And I'm like, I guess we can still be friends, but you, dude, like you're harming people. So
yeah, I won't let you babysit my children.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, and I actually have a specific example of that. I have a friend, her child was in a local Christian elementary school where they felt like, from a Calvinist perspective, they believe in a total depravity, and they felt that they needed to instill a sense of that in the kindergarten children. And so their whole lesson on, you have a dark heart. And she confronted the teacher about the curriculum, and they're like, no, sorry, we believe this. And she's like, I can't let my daughter go to school here then. They wouldn't pull that from the curriculum. So a 5-year-old is being told that fundamentally she has a dark heart. What does that even mean, right? So I think then you have to name what's wrong and what's toxic. You have to say, is there a way of not just making us an us-them barrier of hostility, but also what's a healthy boundary when you see something harmful being disseminated? And to be fair, I can empathize with those who think I'm the one out there harming people by telling them there's no eternal conscious torment. I understand that, so I suppose I can. That goes back to what are they doing? Some are malicious. I think it's around the ego. But what if I start with the assumption that some of even those who would be my great opponents are their foundation is a desire for faithfulness too? That's a different conversation then. And that's not just, what do you call it? That's not just trolling then. They're actually concerned.
Right. I lost my train of thought there. But children.
Yeah.
My son, who's now almost 8, Eden, like your wife, my cousin, he wanted me to tell you that when you do this, it says sus owes us.
Well, then the sus should pay us.
Better. But isn't that, yeah.
That's cute.
Yep. So he has a kid in his life that already scared him to death with hell, because that kid has a different faith tradition than we are. We're Jesus followers. We talk, we pray, we sometimes go to a Central Lutheran church, so where we feel pretty comfortable. But this kid tells him, you're a sinner, you go to hell, and you don't believe in Jesus like my thing does, and so you're going to hell. And he was crying, and it was for us a great opportunity. Even my husband chimed in that that's not what we believe God is like. And I appreciate how my husband actually channeled Brian Zahn, and was like, when God, or when Jesus speaks of hell, where I was pointing out the whole Gehenna thing with the dumpster and the fire and the cleansing, he was saying the people that Jesus talked to that way were really mean people. They tried to be bad, and you're not trying to be bad. You're trying to be just a kid, a loving kid. Yeah. It was a great opportunity, but at the same time, it made me mad for exactly the reasons you just said. I was that kid who ran around the neighborhood. And we had people coming to our parents asking them to tell us to stop evangelizing their children.
Yeah.
Now this is happening to my kid. And then also, of course, I'm thinking, how can we get this kid to stop talking this way? Because he talks to me. He tried to convince me of hell. He tried to convince my husband of hell. And here he is, just a little kid.
Yeah, he could learn some boundaries himself, eh? Without it even being an argument around hell, I suppose, because he's in a pickle because he's got parents and teachers that he trusts who've probably utterly convinced him of this, and somehow it works for him because he's in the in-group, of course. That's part of the strange dynamic, isn't it? It's categorizing the whole world into 2 destinations, and we know who's going to which one. That's probably excusable for a child that age, probably not for someone claiming to be a Bible teacher. And yet, you know what? If I had to believe that, I could go find enough Bible verses probably to support that kind of vision. It's just like, once you hear that you don't have to believe that, then you can just weigh them that you did, like you did. Here's one approach, and it leads to fear and to harm and to PTSD. Here's another approach, same Bible, same faith allegedly, but it's one that is life-giving and encouraging, and it brings about tremendous faith and a desire for God. Well, then now you can choose. And Ephesians 3 says you need to choose the one that is higher, wider, deeper, and longer in its revelation of divine love. So my question then would be, if you can choose from either, what's the pull to the uglier one? If that's all you knew, I get it. For a long time, that's all I knew. But the moment I saw a more beautiful alternative that was just as faithful to the scriptures, then I'm like, why? It didn't even feel like an option. It just also felt like common sense. You go with the more beautiful vision, but I would want to challenge people. They're like, no, I prefer the uglier one. Okay, good. Let's have a chat about that. Where is that coming from? And usually it's from, well, because I think people I don't like should burn forever. It's like, okay, so you're probably in danger of burning forever from your own system. Inside your system, those who withhold mercy are unforgivable in that system. So I don't know. I have not found myself able to argue people out of much, but what we can do is be witnesses. And that's here's a principle. Don't be a judge. Don't lawyer people in your evangelism. You're not even a defendant, so you don't have to be defensive. You're just a witness. And here's what I've seen, here's what I've heard. Do with it what you want, but if it's compelling, that's great. And if not, okay, I'm not going to chase you. The father didn't chase the prodigal son down the road, but his arms sure were open when he came back. And at some point, I guess that itself is a judgment. I'm judging someone as having gone away and needing to come back. But I think it's more that I'm witnessing to how I went away and I'm coming back. So, yeah.
Yeah. This reminds me of David Hayward and his cartoon that introduced us to him and to the idea that there's people out there who have similar conclusions. And it's that cartoon with the sheep, and where Jesus is picking up that sheep, the lost sheep, and they're saying, whoa, what's you doing with that sheep? Don't you know we kicked him out? And it's like, yeah, well, he's a lost sheep because you kicked him out. He wouldn't have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And how to rethink that whole Matthew 18 chapter, which seems to be, for people, they love the idea that it is a very clear cut. Jesus tells us how to handle conflict, and it is like it's in the Bible, and it's so prescriptive, and it works.
Yeah, it's a law.
Yeah, exactly. It's Jesus's law, and what it does is, okay, here's another lost sheep, and then here's another lost sheep, and that was one of the major changes in my vision. I started to see, well, maybe Jesus is describing what we are doing and saying it's not working, instead of saying, here's the prescription for when the next time someone has a heretic question, and lives in that kind of sin.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what that thing. Yeah.
Let's just pause there to say that's a really important principle, that let's not turn the invitations of Jesus into laws with ultimatums, but they are real invitations, and declining his invitations is a lifestyle choice, and that is not healthy. And but like descriptive than rather prescriptive. So even let's say something as subtle as the Beatitudes, Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He is describing a kind of person who's going to receive the kingdom of heaven. He's not prescribing a law to get into the kingdom of heaven. And it's a subtle shift, but it's a really big one also. When we just turn the Sermon on the Mountain into a new kind of legal system instead of Jesus' version of the fruit of the Spirit. If you follow me, here's what's going to show up in your life. And that's more beautiful, I think, and gracious.
Yeah, agreed. I'm not sure what time it is, but I know you have a lot going on. If we could finish with the following segment on descendants.
Sure.
That would be awesome. Because we covered deconstruction, and I wanted to talk about ditches, and I feel like we covered flying away with the kite, and that's not working well, or staying stuck, and that's not working well either.
Yeah.
Now, descendants. You mentioned you were pointing to our actually shared ancestors from Ukraine through your wife Eden. We have a connection only around 8 corners, but I claim it all, and it's exciting to me that we found our way through books and reaching out internet. So it's, for me, being alone here in Minnesota and having no blood relatives around, it's just beside my children, I guess. It's exciting to think that just up in Canada, there's more people that we have.
Your people, yeah.
Right, whatever that means. But being a descendant of these stories of the refugees and also the martyrs is something that I was shaped and formed by as a little kid. My grandparents both, they told us stories from that they remembered being little children and being refugees, being persecuted because of their faith, their Mennonite faith in Ukraine, and the others in Siberia. So through my grandma's side, that's Siberia, and my grandfather's side, Ukraine. And how the soldiers were coming with their guillotines, whatever that is, the pokey guns.
Bayonets.
Bayonets. And not guillotines, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not much versed in weaponry.
You're a hopeless torturer. Just give it up.
Right. I can books. I can ban people. So that the story of how one of them was hiding in a haystack because the soldiers were coming for that person to put them into prison, and they were used as human shields because they were not denouncing being a Mennonite and wouldn't join the army. And so how that soldier was poking through that haystack and somehow missing the person hidden in there, and what effects that had on them as children to see things like that. So basically, I can't say that my 2 older sisters were formed the same way. I guess we're all very different. But to me, that there was something there. There was a heritage of, we take what we believe seriously. We don't claim it. It changes us. And of course, with that, I was also prone to be a fundamentalist, like my grandfather was, and he certainly fell into terrible ditches. My mom, the way she was raised, was quite abusive in ways, but at the core, there was an attempt to be faithful, and but as individual people, we might have histories like that, but we're also, as a faith tradition, we're descendants of people you're describing that in the book. And I think especially for people that come from the faith that is not aware much of its history, of its 2,000-year-old history, I want to give your book a shout out just exactly because of that as well, because there were people who gave their lives or risked their lives all over the place, and so that we could also be living in a culture where we still know these things. You would call it much more eloquently, so I'll pass it on to you.
No, I don't have much to add to that except the effect on me. So on the one side, their faithfulness in the face of death, and in the case of my great uncle, torture as a pastor, and others, of course, Eden's grandpa, directly martyred, on the one hand, it just embarrasses me about the things that could so easily dissuade me from faith. Like the reasons I might give for deconstructing are so lame compared to them laying their lives on the line that I better not. Like I'm tempted far too easily in ways that they stood up to the temptation of, like, will you renounce your faith under threat of torture? No, I won't. Okay. Will I renounce my faith because I was offended by what the pastor said last week? I mean, that's just it really is an embarrassment of modern deconstruction at that level. But it also, I find there's an inspiration in it, and to say, if there's something worth dying for in their faith, it might be worth dying for in my faith. What is it? I want to know the thing that's not negotiable. I want to know what message I carry that I'm just not going to walk away from while millions are walking away. And so that's a troubling thing, is like, why are so many walking away, and are they being driven away by, let's say, by spiritual abuse and toxic theology? And so it's not just on the leaver, it's on those who've generated the felt need to leave by politicized faith, by civil religion with a very thin veneer of Jesus on it that has no substance, by a consumer culture that we generated at some level. So there's all these ways where it's like, oh, I wonder if we could retrieve what they had. That my grandpa, they would go through blizzards and just never miss church. Maybe they should have sometimes. Maybe just like stop. But I just saw this, a deep commitment that they'd get the horses out and they'd have a sleigh, and then they would cover the sleigh with a tarp, and they'd put a wood burning stove on the sleigh, and they'd go through the blizzard to get to church like 10 miles away. And I'm like, what? That's bizarre. So I turned around and came home halfway to church on Sunday because my car was sliding a little bit. It's like, maybe that's not the issue, but like, what is the issue then? What is the real? And to me, it's about Jesus at the end of the day. And what does it mean to follow him? What does it mean to leave him? What does it mean to know him? They knew him. That's the part. Okay. Whatever you do with your sleigh, fine. Go to Sunday service in a blizzard, fine. That's not the issue. The issue is, under threat of death, he was real. And maybe that's what the challenge to the church today is, like, are we presenting a Jesus that's real? Are we facilitating encounters with someone who is real? And that's why I'm a big believer in inner healing ministries, because those encounters happen there in ways I don't see them happen in other venues, let's say. So that's maybe all I'll say about that.
Yeah, yes, you'll have to read the book to learn much more about the witnesses that have survived or not survived.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's ahead for you? What's next besides grading? What are you working on? They always ask that, so I'm going to ask that too.
Sure. So I'm starting to work on a book proposal, and I have not worked it all out yet. But here's where I'm going with it. I'm looking at the fruit of deconstruction and saying, okay, fine. Some people are just leaving, and some people are saying, I don't want to leave. And the difference at some level is a direct experience of God. And so I want to nourish that again, and say, for those who are interested in a direct perception, an experience of their union in Christ, that makes God real to them. Let's have a chat about that. And then I'm interested in how that connects with those who are experiencing God that way, but don't identify as Christian.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on there? And I want to give a Christian account of that. So instead of just saying, well, everyone can meet God because all paths lead to heaven. Well, no, that's just a bland pluralism, in my opinion. But I think there's a Christian explanation for that has to do with Christ being the light of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't be surprised when you see the light of grace shining outside of our camp, but and I've got lots of stories about that. I have thoughts about it, but I have to distill it down to a title. But I'll give you an example. This year I've been reading all the other I've been reading scriptures from the other world religions. And one of the things I read, it's probably 2,000 pages, the Sikh scriptures. And in there, repeatedly, it says, all your religious rituals and your fasting and your pilgrimages, that's fine. But with just one glance of his grace, he washes all your sins away. And I'm like, whoa. And they're so like, you don't earn the grace of God through all these practices. If you would just turn to him in love and recognize your beloved is right there, his grace will. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is better than half the churches in my city are preaching, right? So I'm fascinated by that experience for other people, and where Jesus Christ, who I believe is the fullness of the revelation of God and is God, where is he in that story? And could it be that he's so humble that he's willing to be a part of transformation outside my camp, anonymously? And so, of course, I got a lot of stories from 12-step recovery where that's exactly what we're seeing. But I just don't think that's evidence that Jesus is just one of the ways. I think it's, from a Christian point of view, that he circumscribes the whole cosmos and fills it with his light and glory, and he cares about everyone. So the one crying out to him who has no idea who they're crying out to, he's still the only one listening, and he's the one responding, and he cares enough to touch people who don't have a clue about who he is yet. And that will come across to the other religions as quite condescending, I think. So I have to work out how we would articulate that. Or do we just have to accept that? Or have they themselves testified about Jesus? And I'm seeing that more and more too. So let them be the witnesses. Yeah. That's what I'm working on. It's half baked, put it that way. We'll see what happens out this far side of the oven.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, I wish you well with this project and all your grading. Merry Christmas to you and the family.
Thank you. Likewise, and Happy New Year. I hope the best for you, and I have good reason to.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thanks for all your time here today.
Bless you, Christina. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.